Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Café Sci, December 2021. My name is Brad Peroni from Carnegie Science Center, joined tonight by our colleague Dan Lavoie and by Dr. Patrick Shirey. Before we get into tonight's presentation, I would be remiss if I did not mention that Café Sci is presented by PPG and sponsored by Cook Myosite. And of course, we wouldn't have Café Sci without an audience, so thank you to everyone who is here. And if you'd like to help Café Sci grow, the best thing you can do is to share Café Sci with your friends. Either invite them to join us online or shortly in person. Stay tuned for some announcements about our return to a live format at Carnegie Science Center. You can also share Café Sci with your friends after the fact on Carnegie Science Center's YouTube channel. But I would like to get on with the introductions here. Tonight's guest is Dr. Patrick Shirey, and Dr. Shirey is a certified ecologist, certified fisheries professional, and an assistant professor in the Department of Geology and Environmental Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a Leonard Peters Faculty Fellow in Sustainability with Pitt's Mascaro Center for Sustainable Innovation and serves as an Associate Director with the Pittsburgh Water Collaboratory. Dr. Shirey conducts multidisciplinary research using techniques from his terminal degrees in ecology and law. His recently published research topics include water policy, fisheries history, urban stream restoration, endangered species conservation policy, environmental DNA, and science communication. And as if those weren't enough, he can also put Café Sci speaker in that list after tonight. Thank you, Dr. Shirey, Patrick, for joining us this evening. We're going to turn things over to you. You can take it away.
Thank you, Brad. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my work with you and engaging with the audience. I am a product of the Carnegie Museums. So in the mid-90s, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History started a teen docent program. And I think I was part of the second group. And the notable fact from that is when I was in high school, I was a C student in most of my science classes. And one day in a biology class, Judith Kurlick, the teacher, asked if anyone was interested in this new teen docent program. And I raised my hand and she said, Patrick, are you sure about this? I'm not going to put your name forward unless you're serious. And I said, yes, this sounds like something I could really get interested in. And it was that experience in learning at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and meeting professionals and working there as a volunteer over a year and a half period that I realized that I could potentially do this as a career in a profession. And so I started off at a branch campus of Penn State at Penn State, New Kensington, just north of Pittsburgh. I went on for a master's degree in wildlife, bachelor's degree at Penn State University Park, a master's degree in wildlife science at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a law degree at the Dickinson School of Law at the Pennsylvania State University. And then I combined that background in science and law in a PhD program at the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that work tonight, and then the work I hope to do here in Pittsburgh as I begin a new journey as an assistant professor in the Department of Geology and Environmental Science. And if you want to learn more about our department, go to geology.pitt.edu. And if you want to learn more about the Water Collaboratory in Pittsburgh, go to water.pitt.edu. So I want to start off by talking first about what we mean when we say and talk about ecological restoration. And ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And this is defined by the Society of Ecological Restoration. And this graph on the screen is envisioning a degree of change in a historical system over time. And one of the goals of ecological restoration is to knock an ecosystem back to a historical trajectory. And that can be from prohibitive, and thinking of a place like Manhattan or downtown Pittsburgh, to area where it might require intensive work. And we know this is happening in Pittsburgh, in places like Sawmill Sawmill Run, for example, 9 Mile Run, and other watersheds in Pittsburgh. And then there's modest restoration where there have been minor impacts in the past, and we might be able to knock a system back to historical trajectory without significant intervention. So my lab at the University of Pittsburgh is going to address management challenges with interdisciplinary tools and a focus on hypothesis-driven research. And this combination of ecology, history, and law has been pointed out as a need in the peer-reviewed literature in science by Stephen Jackson and Richard Hobbs in 2009, talked about ecological history playing a role in ecological restoration as a tool to identify and characterize appropriate restoration targets. And J.B. Rule and Margaret Palmer, J.B. Rule is a environmental lawyer and faculty member, and Margaret Palmer is an expert and faculty member in restoration ecology. They called out this need a few years ago in needing efforts to distinguish between creative environmental interventions and ecological restoration in legal and management context being essential. And this is where my work fits, being able to bring the training from the law together with the training in ecological research, and also taking a historical approach when necessary to look back at ecosystem trajectories. So Margaret Palmer and some of her work and other people pointed out that we're spending a lot of money annually, over $1 billion, to restore streams and rivers, but we monitor maybe 10% of these projects that are done. And so one of the challenges is if we don't know whether projects are meeting their intended goals, then we can't say whether the methods taken were successful. And one of the conclusions that this study had drawn, and others, that if we really want to improve stream ecosystems and address water quality and quantity, we need to be thinking about more than just restoring sites, but we need to be thinking about a watershed approach, and that's something that's being discussed here in the Pittsburgh region as well. Another aspect of my work is investigating how we spend money on imperiled species, specifically threatened and endangered listed species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And we spend over $1.5 billion annually on these species. We've had some success stories. There have been some fish species that have been delisted since 2015, including the Modoc sucker, Oregon chub, the Foskett speckled dace, and the Borax lake chub. But we have, for some imperiled species that were once very common, numbering in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions of individuals, delisting is going to be a long-term struggle because of what humans have done to their watersheds and their ecosystems. And two of the examples are the Rio Grande silvery minnow and the Delta smelt. These are ones that you may have seen in national news and certainly regional news if you're familiar with California and New Mexico. So I'm going to talk about some of these research themes as we go through tonight. First, the theme one is the ecological restoration in the context of history and law, using a case study from South Bend, Indiana. And the second theme is using history as required by law under the Organic Act of the National Park Service to inform ecological research and restoration. And the case study for this is the Namakagon River in Northwest Wisconsin. And the third theme is efforts to improve the efficacy of imperiled species recovery. And case study we'll use here is the Rio Grande silvery minnow, and then briefly discuss expenditures under the Endangered Species Act and work I'm currently doing on that. So the first theme, the key point I want to address is how do our laws conflict with science-based management, and specifically for Judeo Creek, it's the Indiana drainage law, and I'll get into the drainage law and its implications after discussing the background of Judeo Creek. So I got involved in this project in 2007 when I was a first-year PhD student at the University of Notre Dame, and it was a project that had began a decade before in 1997, and I'll talk a little bit about that history in a moment. The goal was to monitor the stream to inform efficacy of fish habitat restoration, informing whether the efforts to restore the stream to a historical trajectory worked based on the goals identified. The second thing did was put the results in context with history, noting that 37% of the watershed in 1829 was wetland and less than 1% of the watershed is wetland today. One of the things that happened during the study was that under the drainage law, the drainage board came in and we removed wood, which is a habitat feature for fish, removed it because wood is defined as an obstruction under the Indiana drainage law. One of the things we noted was a decline in fish biomass as a result of wood removal. And so I realized, well, we can't just be reporting the science if we ignore the policy. We might miss out on informing where policy might conflict with science-based management. So Judeo Creek's a third order tributary of the St. Joseph River. The St. Joseph River flows through Mishawaka and South Bend in Indiana, empties into Lake Michigan in the state of Michigan. The watershed is a 63% mixed deciduous oak hickory forest historically, and 37% wet prairie marsh habitat in the headwaters. And we know this from the General Land Office surveys conducted in 1829. If you want to learn more about the history and impact on the waters of drainage law, I encourage you to watch the documentary Everglades of the North. It's an excellent documentary that talks about the history, talks about how destruction of these wetlands resulted in over a fifth of the populations of migratory birds being wiped out in North America. Incredibly important impact on the landscape when we talk about management of wildlife. The Kankakee headwaters just west of the St. Joseph River were called Chicago's breadbasket at one point in time. And I also have to point out the human impact on the landscape. The Potawatomi and Miami people indigenous to this area managed this landscape with controlled burns. And they also had crop rotations of species that are unseen today in terms of dozens of species grown in their agricultural fields that were rotated. And the Potawatomi are working to restore some of these streams and wetlands. And I'm going to talk about that at the end after presenting my work. So the drainage law, quite frankly, was an act of cultural genocide against the indigenous residents of these lands. And the universities were also complicit in this. The University of Notre Dame had a professor, Arthur Stace, that was also the county surveyor, and the county surveyor was responsible for drainage of the swamplands. Under the federal laws, the states could take the land from the federal government if they drained the wetlands. And in 1885, Arthur Stace wrote, "Clearing has begun, drainage will follow, and the monotonous usefulness of arable land will supplant this natural botanic garden." And he realized that the drainage was destroying the native plant community, and wrote such in the Notre Dame Scholastic in 1885. And so this is an example where the drainage laws changed the history of the landscape, the history of the watershed, and continue to impact management today. As early as 1875, Judeo Creek was called a state ditch. Earlier maps in the 1860s called it Sheffield Creek. And in some of the writings published by the students in Notre Dame Scholastic and the faculty, they had noted the students visiting Judeo Creek in the mid and late 1800s, and then all of a sudden they stopped visiting the stream, and in part because it became a state ditch. It was no longer referred to as a pretty stream. It was started to be referred to as a state ditch in some of these writings. And fast forward 100 years, the watershed faced increasing urbanization and conversion from the agricultural land to residential and commercial use. And that resulted in some changes to zoning. and people paying attention. The Isaac Walton League Conservation Organization owns land at the mouth of Judeo Creek, and they care about the fishing opportunities in fish community. And so when the university proposed adding a golf course adjacent to Judeo Creek, some residents of the watershed were upset, and they asked the university to go back to the drawing board, and they did, and they rerouted they redrew the plans and decided to reroute the creek and restore it to some historic meanders that were taken out as a result of drainage and ditching the stream. So when they decided to do this, they involved faculty members at the University of Notre Dame. They involved civil engineers in the community. They involved people in the state and federal government to plan the restoration. And one of the goals was to improve the stream channel, but increase habitat and enhance the fish diversity of the stream. So here you can see an aerial image of the stream, and you can see the white arrows pointing to the abandoned channels, and then the area where the stream was relocated. The labels U1 and U2 are the unrestored reaches that were monitored, and the labels R1 and R2 refer to the stream reaches that were restored, that were monitored over a period of 17 years. So for our fish surveys, we block net a section with nets, and this prevents the fish from moving in and out. And we do multiple passes of electrofishing, and that allows us to get quantitative estimates, so we can put error bars on our population estimates, so we can have confidence intervals of the total number of the fish. We identify the fish to species, we weigh the fish, measure the fish, and then return them to the stream after we're finished. One of the interesting things that happened, and one of the goals of the restoration in the first place, I mentioned the Isaac Walton League owning property. Well, they care about fishing for introduced brown trout and rainbow trout. Brown trout being introduced from Europe around 1900, and rainbow trout being introduced from the Pacific Northwest. One of the interesting things that we noted was that trout declined to zero in all reaches in 2012, but the native species increased in abundance. The rock bass, smallmouth bass, and largemouth bass increased. And one thing of note is that rock bass are intolerant of silt and intolerant of pollution. And being a native species, it was something that could be looked on as being a positive outcome of what was happening in these reaches that were restored and in the watershed in general. This also highlighted the importance of monitoring restoration sites and sites in general in streams and rivers for a longer period of time. A lot of these projects may be monitored for 2 years, at most typically 5 years. And if we don't monitor beyond that time, we may be missing some population changes that happen as a result of changes in the watershed, changes due to the restoration. And this can also be shown with some of the species that people don't catch on hook and a line. Most notably the Johnny Darter and mottled sculpin, two species we also find here in Pennsylvania, like the trout and the bass. These species, they don't move very much in a given year. Studies have shown mottled sculpin may move only tens of meters in a given year. People that have tagged them and monitored them discover they don't move very far. So if you take a stream and introduce meanders that weren't there, it may take a while for the species to colonize, to reproduce. And so another aspect of this outcome of monitoring over a 17-year period is that we saw the populations of these fish increases as well. And it allows us to draw different conclusions that the habitat in the restored reaches was really providing favorable conditions, especially for the mottled sculpin. Another way we can look at the fish community is a technique called non-metric multidimensional scaling. And it's really a mathematical tool for examining distance between ecological communities. And this can be used for human populations. This can be used for other studies as well. But basically, looking at this chart is it's taking a multidimensional space and smashing it into 2 dimensions. And the points nearest one another on this are more similar than the points that are further away. And the unrestored reaches are denoted by square and circle, and the restored reaches are denoted by triangles. And then larger size shapes indicate higher amount of biomass, and the shading from 1997 to 2012 goes from dark to light over time. This kind of confirmed what we were witnessing with the individual fish populations, that there was this shift from non-native brown trout and rainbow trout to species assemblage dominated by black-nosed dace and creek chub and mottled sculpin, to one being dominated by bass, by rock bass, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, and other centrarchids in the stream. And so this was another way to confirm what we were seeing with the individual species over time. One of the things we had noted was that the habitat changed in some of our unrestored reaches due to the recruitment of large wood from fallen trees. And this happened as a result of a storm event in 2008. We often see this here in Pennsylvania as well. When you have a hurricane hit the Gulf Coast and move northward, we will get high winds and heavy rain for sometimes 24, 48 hours. And this is what happened in 2008 in South Bend, and it knocked wood into the stream. And what we noticed was that these logs were creating habitat by scouring pools and creating riffles in the stream. And so one of the things that happened was that the fish biomass increased in the unrestored reaches. And they increased as much by 4 times, and then decreased by 4 times when the wood was removed by stream managers under the Indiana drainage law. One of the outcomes then is that if we want to continue to see species like smallmouth bass and rockmouth bass and largemouth bass, is that we need to be thinking about the habitat and the cover that the wood is providing these fish. And the Indiana drainage law maintains that these are obstructions that have to be removed if the county drainage board determines that they could be obstructing flow. And one of the things in the couple of years of monitoring the stream, after this wood was recruited, the stream never flooded its banks in this area as a result of this wood. The stream was able to flow past. So these logs were not creating an obstruction that was going to result in flooding the golf course. And when the wood was removed, the biomass declined in the unrestored reaches compared to the reaches that were restored. So one of the things after realizing, when we explained to the drainage board, hey, you're messing with the long-term study site, and it was, well, the drainage law allows us to do this. And in reviewing the drainage law, I started to realize, well, it's antiquated in that regard and how we treat ecosystems, but it's also somewhat progressive in that watershed landowners pay for stream maintenance. And one of the ways it's progressive, when we think about municipalities, governments talking about stormwater management fees or taxes. It's something that's been discussed in the Pittsburgh region and is being implemented. The drainage laws can serve as an example of where a tax is levied. They owned a house in the drainage just north of Judeo Creek. It was called the Kiefer Ditch, and purchased the home. There was a lien on it, and the lien included a $5 annual fee to the drainage board for management of the ditch. The other way that this law is progressive, it allows quick removal of invasive species like knotweed that we deal with here on our rivers in Pennsylvania. The downside to this is mowing vegetation, which happens regularly under the drainage law, whether the vegetation is native or not, is counter to most best management practices and is done often as maintenance, as shown from photos from the Elkhart River Restoration Association website here. The other thing the law requires is trash removal. It specifically requires removal of trash, removal of livestock that get into drainage ditch, they're allowed into drainage ditches. But the downside is that the drainage law also requires removal of obstructions that provide habitat like large wood. And so we're left with the question, do residents of these watersheds want to continue managing their streams as ditches? Do people want to improve water quality and improve fish community, or do they want to continue the status quo? Well, the Judeo Creek Task Force, one of the early task force dealing with watershed issues in the region, they've developed a planning process and ordinances to at least require site design work when you're proposing new development to incorporate efforts that reduce non-point source pollution. And this is not only beneficial to the stream ecosystem, to the fish, to water quality, but there's a cost savings involved. And in the case example of the St. Joseph Regional Medical Center, where my oldest daughter was born, the hospital had sought out architects, landscape architects that could do this work more cost effectively than the traditional gray infrastructure that's used to manage stormwater. And so when you go to the St. Joseph Regional Medical Center, there are these beautifully landscaped retention ponds with native vegetation around the hospital campus. But there is the environmental conundrum that I pointed out. The county Drainage Board also has spent money on projects to add anchored wood in other sections while removing this loose wood as maintenance. And so here's an example from 2013 of a restoration project with anchored wood added in the design, and you can see it with the red circles highlighting where the wood was anchored, but if they come through and remove wood in other sections of the stream. And they did it in December of 2018 from the restored sections of the stream where wood was added in 1997. So the challenge under the drainage law, and an example is when you have laws that result in actions that are counter to maybe best science, that if you don't change the laws, you're going to continue to run into a problem over time. And an example of this is recently in the state of Wisconsin, where wood removal was done adjacent in a stream adjacent to a fifth generation potato farmer who wanted to increase the native brook trout. And the farmer spent Christmas trees, added logs to this drainage ditch, and the drainage board ordered him to remove it. And when he said no, they went in and removed it. Well, the farmer sued because he had spent money on adding this wood and also increased the abundance of the brook trout population. Just the sheer numbers of brook trout shown in these photographs. I've only seen this congregation abundance in brook trout in 2 locations in my life in the wild. And normally such a thing for improving native species is something that's celebrated. And so the judge reviewing what happened and making the initial decision said it was the most pig-headed decision he had seen by a government agency in his 29 years in the legal system. The appellate court held that decision, and then the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided not to hear it. And so ultimately the farmer won the case, and the county drainage board was required to pay and restore the brook trout habitat that he created in this drainage ditch. So some of the lessons I want to finish with of monitoring Judeo Creek was that, as I pointed out, for more than 5 years of monitoring is necessary to quantify changes in some fish populations. That there's a demonstrated, we demonstrated the importance of large wood to biomass of fish, and we documented the conflicting use of drainage tax resources. And I want to point out that there are hundreds of individuals that have contributed to this work and helping monitoring over the years, and we acknowledge them in the manuscript that's freely available online and published in Ecology and Society, and the title is Long-Term Fish Community Response to a Reach Scale Stream Restoration. For another perspective on what the forced removal that I mentioned earlier in the discussion, I'd encourage you to read this piece by Elon Pochedli on using restorative cartography to revisit the land that was taken by the Potawatomi at gunpoint in Indiana in 1838. The Pokagon band of Potawatomi continued to reside on their ancestral lands because Leopold Pokagon went and purchased the property that he and others had just agreed to transfer to the U.S. federal government at the time, went back to Michigan and purchased that land. And so the Pokagon band still resides on their ancestral lands in southern Michigan and northern Indiana, and they're working to restore some of these streams and wetlands. But other communities of Potawatomi that are forcibly removed are looking to find ways to come back on landscape and take back the land that was stolen from them. Their leader did not sign that treaty, and yet they were forcibly removed. So it gets into implications of federal law and state law and issues of justice, and it uses science to map out how the Potawatomi can return to the ancestral land that's rightfully theirs. The second project I want to talk to you about and theme is using history and science as required by law under the National Park Service Organic Act to inform environmental management. And the case study for this is managing for native brook trout in the Namakagon River in Cable, Wisconsin. And the name Namakagon comes from the Ojibwe language, and it means a river at the place of the sturgeon in the Ojibwe language. And it was culturally important because the Ojibwe in this area would come annually for the sturgeon migration to harvest and have cultural gatherings around the sturgeon harvest. And the dams, logging dams and hydroelectric dams later destroyed the sturgeon populations. And so it eliminated in many of these waters a culturally important species that remains culturally important today. And so when we talk about informing habitat restoration, what we're saying is under the National Park Service Organic Act is a time of pre-European settlement and colonization on the landscape. So one of the things the agencies were discussing doing was adding wood to the river system. And to do so, they needed to demonstrate that adding wood would actually be restoration. And it was through this work and doing a fish habitat history report with colleagues with the National Park Service that realized what we really needed in the river was monitoring water temperatures to see whether the temperatures were suitable for brook trout or not. And one of the reasons why is because brown trout have been introduced to the river system, and they occupy the main stem and tributaries. So in the late 1800s, starting around 1880 in the Namakagon River watershed, vast stands of pine, hemlock, and hardwoods were logged. So this photograph on the left of the Drummond Historical Museum, it just reminds me of something you think to see in the Pacific Northwest and not in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but there were just vast stands that were clear cut to the point of some of the photos showing what looked like a moonscape and not what was then at present then and what is at present. And so you can see what this landscape looked like with this northern Wisconsin cub. And an example on the right of just the billions of board feet of lumber that were taken from these river basins. This is just one alleyway in the lumberyard in Hayward, Wisconsin. So one of the aspects of this fish habitat history report was trying to look back and describe the habitat and fishing conditions, the fish community composition that existed in pre-logging. And one of the things noted is the habitat descriptions changed in a 20-year period. And just want to summarize this by saying pre-logging conditions, there were publications that were put out by railroad and tourism publications saying that you waited out until you were clear of all brush to cast your line in the middle of the Namakagon River. This is the earliest known photograph we have of the Namakagon near Cable, Wisconsin. And then later, the publications described fishing the river is that there is no brush to bother the angler, tangle the line, and breed profanity. And so the description of fishing changed in a very short period of time. And then later, Sigurd Olsen, a renowned naturalist in the area, when he was working on his in-laws farm, before they were his in-laws, when he was a young adult, later wrote he fished the Namakagon when it was full of brook trout before the brown trout came in, and when it was unusual to catch a northern pike or a bass. And so we know, even though that there was a lot of abuse happening as a result of the logging drives on this river system, that the brook trout survived the logging drives. One of the things the agencies have done in terms of setting goals is to identify a goal to restore the river to a condition that will support a cold water fish community dominated by brook trout, the top predator at the time of 1880. The Wisconsin DNR has a position to manage for introduced brown trout in place of brook trout under the threat of climate change. But this is in conflict with the National Park Service, which has a mandate under their laws to protect native species. So there's a bit of a challenge here, and it shows why, in addition to informing management with environmental history and ecology, we also need to be cognizant of the laws and policies under which the agencies operate. And so one of the questions we had was, are warm summer temperatures restricting the current range of brook trout in the Namakagon River? And the quick answer that we had from the U.S. Geological Survey temperature data was no, that they weren't restricting. And in fact, if you look over the time of the temperature gauge that was available, that actually for brook trout, they have more of time throughout the year of temperatures that are within their optimal growing temperature for the species. And one of the interesting studies that looked at brook trout and the role temperature plays was in the Moose River in New York, and the authors of this study took temperature loggers and implanted them in the body cavities of brook trout, and then also put temperature loggers in the stream. And they were able to determine that the brook trout were able to seek out areas of thermal refuge that the temperature loggers that the scientists deployed were not detecting. And so the brook trout were able to find the water that was upwelling in the stream coming up from groundwater and hyporheic flow. The brook trout were able to seek that out. And so we know from these other studies that even when it gets warm, brook trout have a keen sense to go where the cold waters are. So we wanted to know what the temperature was like throughout the upper Namakagon River. So we deployed 95 temperature loggers to provide the National Park Service with data for identifying habitat that was thermally suitable. I quickly discovered that this was a lot to maintain over time, and I reduced them to 44 that are deployed from 2012 to present. I went last year and collected them and redeployed them, so now have over 8 years of data on temperatures in the Namakagon River. And one of the key results is that there are these cold water areas that are in the vicinity of spring seeps that can provide this summer refuge for brook trout. And the evidence from our loggers suggests that temperature alone is not restricting brook trout in the Namakagon River. And the way I've shown this here is under 20 degrees Celsius, brook trout are going to do just fine. When you get into warmer temperatures, they have to seek out cooler waters, or the temperatures over a longer period of time become lethal. And July, the period of mid-July is really the critical threshold for brook trout in the Namakagon River, where they have to go in the tributaries and they have to go in the spring seep areas to survive. So what do we find out over time? Well, the spring seeps in this river system appear to provide a stabilizing influence on temperature in the Namakagon downstream of tributary influences. And one of the amazing things is some of these spring seeps are a constant remain constant at the average annual temperature of this area. So this spring seep is 7.5 degrees Celsius year round. It doesn't matter when it is and throughout the years. And so over time, one of the concerns could be if you start to see spring seeps that are fed by the groundwater start to warm, that's a sign that the river system could shift to potentially keep trout from surviving. But we don't have evidence to say the brook trout couldn't survive in the absence of brown trout in the river system. And one of the important things is that brown trout are present, and brown trout are known to outcompete brook trout. And I have this flow chart here, but really I want you to pay attention to the bottom, because under existing law and policy, brown trout are considered an exotic species because they're not specifically mentioned in the law that created the Namakagon River as a park under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And if you can't remove them, then you have to maintain the status quo. You don't do nothing that would end up favoring the exotic. If you can remove them, then the park has to implement removal and eradication program before conducting any restoration work on the river. So if they wanted to drop whole trees and create wood cover for any fish, they would have to remove the exotic, or they would risk violating the law in doing so. So some of the lessons learned here from the Namakagon is a retrospective approach is not only needed under the law for restoration under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968 and the Park Service Organic Act of 1916, but it's beneficial. And an interdisciplinary approach can inform disciplinary research questions as needed by resource management agencies. And there are dozens of individuals that have contributed to this project over time. In addition to the publications we put out, there's still ongoing work with temperature and with proposed restoration projects for the Namakagon River. So just have to thank the Park Service for their support, specifically the George Melendez Wright Climate Change Fellowship, and then the Great Lakes Northern Forest Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit, the Wisconsin DNR, and Notre Dame Center for Aquatic Conservation. And then I also, because of the importance of me, I also, on my own dime, after these projects were completed, I've continued to go up, get the temperature loggers, and redeploy them because I believe this type of work is important. The third and final theme I want to discuss with you is work to improve the efficacy of imperiled species recovery and focus on a species I studied for my master's degree at New Mexico State, the Rio Grande silvery minnow. Once a species that numbered in the hundreds of millions from northern New Mexico all the way to Brownsville, Texas, and including the Pecos River. And a key point here is the importance of feedback on the implementation side of policymaking. So one of the challenges is that we've spent over $150 million on recovery of the Rio Grande silvery minnow, and this money has been necessary, but we've not come close to the goals set for delisting. One of the things I did was, in thinking about what could we learn about the fish, is, well, we didn't know much about its diet other than it grazed on the bottom of the streams. And so I said, what could we do to find the diet? Well, getting permission to collect an endangered fish from the wild and dissect it for determining diet is not easy to do, and for good reason. So one of the things I thought is, well, what if we go to places where the fish are preserved? And there are a couple of places, including the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, universities like Eastern New Mexico University. Look back at time prior to when dams were added to the Rio Grande, and noted the areas where the fish were foraging indicated that the algae, the single cellular algae, the diatoms, were growing on a mud substrate in 1874, and the diatoms were growing in a sand substrate in 1978. And this alone is not very powerful because you don't have repeated samples over time, but it does give us a window to what the Rio Grande looked like in a way that we didn't have other techniques available to us to do. This is just a photograph of what the Rio Grande looked like prior to major modifications. These are women from the San Ildefonso Pueblo collecting water from the Rio Grande in 1905, and then a contemporary photograph in 2004 of what the Rio Grande looks like in this reach today. It's a very different river system. And so one of the things that the agencies have done is reintroduce the Rio Grande silvery minnow to other areas where it's been extirpated, but these efforts have not succeeded. Why? Well, if we look to the geomorphology literature, we can understand why, because the river has changed and the plant communities have changed to one where the river was wider, the river flooded its banks more, to contemporary conditions where the river doesn't flood its banks, and there's non-native vegetation present that alters the dynamics of the channel. So we look to geomorphology, we start to understand why these efforts may have failed. And the other reasons why is that we may not be thinking about this species in historical conditions under which the species evolved. And it was previously thought that this fish was a pelagic spawning species, and that means that it spawns in the open water, and the eggs in the case of a river system would drift until hatching or till entrapped in backwaters. And in looking at some of the other life history aspects of similar species like the eastern silvery minnow, I started to question this model, and he said, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And so Nick Medley at the National Park Service and I started to review what the historical conditions were of the river and what the life history aspects are for the sister species that are related to the Rio Grande silvery minnow from an evolutionary perspective. And so started to broaden the research to consider history, including maps and photographs and historical descriptions of the river system. And you can see in this photograph of the Rio Grande at Central Avenue in Albuquerque that the river looked very different in as late as 1933, before a lot of these major modifications happened, compared to the Rio Grande at Central Avenue today. The river looks very different. It's a single channel. It's not multi-threaded. When it floods its banks, it's up against non-native vegetation and jetty jacks that were added to harden the bank. And so the river has been simplified from a braided channel that often flooded its banks to a single channel. And one of the things we proposed was that the Rio Grande silvery minnow was a floodplain spawning species. Well, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission built an experimental study facility to study the Rio Grande silvery minnow and help propagate it in captivity. And so one of the things they were doing at the time was, when they had the spring waters rise from the snowmelt, is they were studying silver minnow behavior and how they spawn. And so at first they were putting sandbags on the areas that were the artificial floodplain in this channel. And what Nick Medley said to them is, why don't you take a few of the sandbags off and see what happens? And what happened was the adult silvery minnow go into the floodplain and spawn. And so the scientists at the Los Lunas facility started to put tags on the fish and monitor this behavior, and have continued to monitor it, and have published this and said that these artificial conditions confirm what is difficult to do in monitoring in the Rio Grande, because if you go in the Rio Grande when it's flooding, you're going to risk drowning. But you can do this in an artificial facility, and it responds to a stage change, and they leave the main channel, they enter this low velocity floodplain habitat, and they spawn. And so it confirmed what we suspected, that this species, we need to think of it a little bit differently than we've been thinking about it to effectively recover it. One of the problems, as I pointed out with introducing this fish, is we need alternatives, because the introductions have not been successful. Over 2 million minnows were introduced in the Big Bend National Park reach, and I think they caught less than 20 in subsequent surveys to document it. So the introduction efforts failed, and they put a stop to it. So one of the things I thought of, where is habitat available in the Rio Grande if it's not available in historic area? Well, if you look above the rapids in the northern portion of New Mexico into Colorado, where the species was never documented because of those rapids and not being able to get past them. There may be necessary habitat that could be available and could be beneficial for the Rio Grande silver minnow. And so we asked, would it be possible to move the fish outside the historic range or other species outside the historic range? And so this is where the law comes into play, because restrictions added in 1984 under the Reagan administration to protect private landowners from species impacting what they might be able to do on their land. The law and regulations were changed under the law to say you had to document that the historic range had been unsuitably and irreversibly altered or destroyed. And that's a really difficult legal standard to overcome. And so like the drainage law, these are legacies in terms of finding creative ways to manage ecosystems that ecosystem managers, that scientists have to deal with. Real briefly, I'm going to finish on discussing the improvement of efficacy of species recovery to talk about some ongoing work. And that is looking at expenditures. I mentioned the amount of money that has been spent on the Rio Grande silver minnow since listing. Well, wanted to know, if we look at all fish species listed under the Act, how are monies being spent, and what are the priorities? And in really, to summarize this work, the two things that really influence expenditures for fish species, not the priority ranking system the Fish and Wildlife Service devised in the 1980s to prioritize recovery, it's whether a species has been litigated in the federal courts or whether a species has been propagated in captivity. And this makes sense because if you file a lawsuit and the agency does not have enough data, they're going to later maintain collecting data to be able to defend their actions in subsequent lawsuits. In the case of propagating a species in captivity, it's an expensive thing to do because you need a facility, you need personnel, and for some of these species, it results in increased expenditures. So under the guidelines and regulations the agency established, there was supposed to be a priority ranking system based on species rarity and uniqueness that isn't being met because of these other challenges. And so this is work that's currently in revision that I'm working on with Sue Colvin at Arkansas Tech. Some of the lessons learned take home is to inform recovery efforts. We got to place life history in context of past conditions. We need to have cost-effective approaches that can help avoid sunk costs in managing endangered species, and that expenditures are not matching priorities. They're influenced by litigation and whether a species is being propagated in captivity. So I want to talk locally briefly here about some of the things that have ongoing and some of the things I'd like to be doing here in Pittsburgh. One of the things that I've done is partnered with municipal engineers, including Ron Olson and Phil Griskowitz at Olson and Associates in Butler. In Adams Township, they serve as the municipal engineers, and under the Clean Water Act, urbanized and urban watersheds have to fix sediment and water pollution. And some of these streams are covered in legacy sediment. And if you look at the floodplain, we had backhoes dig down in the floodplain. It takes 2 meters to get the historical floodplain in these streams. And you can see in the lower left, just clumps of sediment that are falling into the stream. This is not what the stream bank would have looked like historically. It would have been a much broader floodplain and including wetlands. And so local civil engineers are working to restore some of these streams. So how can we work to help provide access to nature in all communities? This billboard was taken a few years ago. This photo of this billboard in between Verona and Oakmont at Plum Creek was taken a few years ago. And I noted because every neighborhood has a naturehood, but here in Verona and Oakmont, this naturehood is not accessible. This stream has invasive plants on the channels. There's a concrete wall. There's private property. And so have efforts to encourage getting out into nature, and especially young people, but we have no public access in some communities. So some things I'd like to do here in the Pittsburgh community is help facilitate integrative research that addresses the critical water issues. This is something I've done with issues under the Clean Water Act and definition of waters in the United States. This is a review manuscript that you can get online at fisheries.org, and it addresses critical water issues related to policy and how the original the definition that was removed under the Trump administration is now being reconsidered under the Biden administration. Was a science-based definition. And this article was submitted by Senator Tom Carper from Delaware in the Environment and Public Works hearing record. The second objective I have is to support others in development and delivery of outreach, policy, and community engagement. And this includes K through 12 efforts and recent effort published online, our efforts in Chicago River and to engage youth at a teen lab that's freely accessible to teens in Chicago at the Shed Aquarium. And then also in using citizen science and how working with watershed groups can help monitor temperature and take repeat photographs. And I'm currently working with the Chalfont Run, Thompson Run Watershed Association, and we're discussing work on the stream in the newly acquired by the Allegheny Land Trust, newly acquired Churchill Valley Greenway that used to be the Churchill Valley Country Club. The third objective is to facilitate development of diverse perspectives for addressing water resource challenges and foster an inclusive environment and advance opportunities. I've worked with the Stockbridge Munsee community in Wisconsin, the Mohican Nation. They're not on their ancestral lands, they're on the ancestral lands of the nominee. They're one of the three tribal communities that sided with the 13 colonies in the Revolutionary War. Their thanks was years later being forcibly removed, and Stockbridge, Massachusetts, being taken over by the Massachusetts governor. So it's a sad example of our history of how Indigenous communities have been impacted, and so it's an area where I want to continue to engage and help them reclaim their lands and waters. Fourth objective I have in my work is to help provide environmental policy training seminars, and I had experience in training through the Communication Partnership Through Science in the Sea and the Ecological Society of America, and that's something I want to provide to students in the community, that we make mistakes in a safe learning environment and then apply those skills in a more challenging environment. And finally, one of the things I want to do is help build a stimulating transdisciplinary environment for research and education to develop the next generation of engaged citizens. This is something I've done through K through 12 outreach programs, and it's also something I've done through undergraduate student engagement and research. And this is not just students that go on to and work in environmental sciences, but in the case here of Trixie Amarato in the taking notes in the left, going on to become a medical doctor, and Stephanie Goldstein pursuing a PhD at UC Santa Barbara in English. And so these students carry forward these experiences. In her bio, one of the things Trixie mentions, Patricia says that if she wasn't a medical doctor, she would probably be a park ranger in a national park. And then one of the things I've done here at the University of Pittsburgh over the last couple of years, starting in 2019, is the Provost Academy for incoming first-year students, getting them engaged in the campus. One of the ways we've done this is had them plant pawpaw seedlings on the Pitt campus School of Public Health lawn in Frick Park. And then this year, 27 seedlings planted outside the baseball field outfield wall. You can see the students here planting in the photographs, planting these seedlings, and we had great help from the Pitt grounds crew in making this happen. And it's exciting because we envision that 5 years post-graduation, the students' fifth homecoming, they come back to harvest the fruit of these trees. And so I'm happy to engage in conversation and answer any questions about the research, about the teaching, and just want to thank you for your time and attention this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. There is no shortage of big problems that need tackling out there, and when we talk about restoration efforts, for an entire ecosystem, there's a lot of personal interest and jockeying and wrangling that needs to go on. So no shortage of complexity there. So folks, if you have some questions, we would love it if you would post those in the Q&A function that you'll see down in the bottom of your Zoom window. You just hit that Q&A button, and you can type those questions in, and we'll take as many questions as we can. While you're thinking of that, a couple of things I would like to mention for everyone's benefit. Earlier in your talk, Patrick, you mentioned the Everglades of the North, and I wanted to mention that there is actually a new documentary film called Wings Over Water that is produced by SK Films that follows the journeys of sandhill cranes, mallard ducks, and yellow warblers, and the mid-continent prairie and wetland habitats that have changed so much. You can find that in the Rangos Giant Cinema coming up in 2022. So come on over to the Science Center and see that next year. And I would also, since we're talking about some policy and things like that tonight, would love to mention that this Thursday we are welcoming Dr. John Kennedy, who is involved in the PA congressional redistricting effort that's going on right now, talking about how districts can be generated, talking about gerrymandering in general, and talking about how communities of interest can be collected together to form congressional districts that might be able to tackle some of the problems that we're learning about tonight with these ecosystem initiatives. And so while you're all filling in your questions, furiously typing away, I'm sure, I would also like to say that we are planning to bring Café Sci back on site at the Science Center. It looks like we'll be able to start that in February of 22. We were hoping to start that back the first Monday of the year, but there's a Monday night football game at Heinz Field, and that's going to win.
Priorities.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't go anywhere near that area
No,
during Monday Night Football.
absolutely not. So one thing I also wanted to ask about too is, so you mentioned using some museum specimens in research for the Rio Grande case that you're talking about there. And I'm just curious if you can just tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, looking at some of these old preserved fish, I would imagine there are some gaps that you need to fill in. So how difficult is that compared to actually dissecting a fish to see how what its diet is like?
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I wish it was something that I thought about on my own, but I wasn't the first. It was a faculty member at John Carroll University at the time. They did it for some fish in Ohio, and essentially what you do is you remove the intestines, the stomach of the fish, and then you can either examine the contents under the microscope fresh in terms of all the material, or in this case, what in looking at some of the fresh contents decided to do was digest those contents in with diatoms. They have a cell wall that's made of glass. And so that cell wall just preserves really well. It will preserve for millions of years. And so people often look at sedimentary records to look back in time of what the algal community was in terms of diatoms using those glass cell walls. And so one of the things you can do is digest it in hydrogen peroxide and acid, and then you mount it on a microscope slide and count the individual cells of algae. And the great thing about using diatoms is that not only are there a number of species, but then each one of those species has specific habitat tolerances. So specific tolerances for temperature, for pH, for pollution. And so you can even say like, oh, this species is here and it was tolerant of sewage, tolerant of human feces. And so there you can get that level of detail. Forensic scientists will do that. Say if someone is drowned in a river, they can tell time of death based on the diatoms in the lungs.
Excellent, thank you. So Dan, I think we have some questions coming in from the audience. Do you want to start sending some of those over?
Yeah, absolutely. Here. We have Chris O has asked, what suggestions do you have for getting local communities interested or invested in the health of their local streams?
Yeah, suggestions for getting local community interest invested. I think there are a number of groups. I know locally, if I serve on some of the watershed boards, including the 9 Mile Run Restoration Committee, and then the Buffalo Creek watershed group, newly formed by the Audubon Society. And so some of the local nonprofits have taken efforts to get the local communities interested in and engaged. One of the things the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania did, they bought property along the Little Buffalo Creek and put a nature center in, and they had a watershed festival day here in September. And so I biked my daughters over and we visited, and the Soil and Water Conservation District folks were there, from Butler County, from Armstrong County, other conservation groups were in the area. So one of the things I think, and they had 350, 400 people, I think, as their final count for the day. One of the things that we can do, and one of the things we have a proposal out to do for Chalfont Run, Thompson Run, is have communities engage around food, public events and food, and get together to do some water sampling, fish community sampling, and do it around events that have food, catered events. And so that's one way that I think we can do locally that some of the nonprofits are already engaging in. People care about water quality. People care about drinking water. People also care about the fish, having fish to harvest. You know, one of the advantages here in Pittsburgh of improving our water quality is having fishing tournaments on the river. And that's not something my grandparents were able to do. They would have gone north to their camps to go fishing because the rivers were dead rivers for a long period of time.
Excellent. Thank you. And a follow-up to that one, we had a question from Bill Mao. I apologize if I've butchered your last name. Citizen science currently has very little formal standing in government decision-making. Do you see a trend toward making citizen acquired data more relevant?
You know, one of the classic examples of citizen acquired data is the individual that put temperature monitoring station in Hawaii, and how that over a period of time has helped inform conversations on climate science. And so there are a lot of good examples of where citizens have informed public decision making. Now, the question then, it gets into government decision trend toward making citizen acquired data more relevant. I think you're seeing more of that happen because of the availability of tools. Temperature loggers are easy to deploy and can collect for longer periods of time. You think about use of drones and how drones can acquire data, and people having drones and taking aerial imagery allows us to look at areas in ways that we haven't done in the past. And citizen efforts like I mentioned the Churchill Valley Greenway converting from a golf course, and that was under threat of being developed, and citizens coming together and using the knowledge they had to purchase that and make what was formerly exclusive club available to an inclusive community and 95,000 people within 3-mile distance of Churchill Valley. So I know that the organizations I'm involved with, there's always a citizen science component at our annual meetings. I was just at the American Fisheries Society meeting in Baltimore a few weeks ago, and citizen science component is involved in a lot of people's presentations, and the same with the Ecological Society of America, which I've been involved with in the past, attending their conferences. So yes, there is that trend, but it is challenging because we have agencies that have a certain way of doing things, and so getting that going is not easy, and sometimes it just takes citizen initiative and effort to make it happen. And once you have data sets, then the government can use them for decision making.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you said that, and the way you were talking about the antiquated laws earlier in the first portion of your talk tonight. That just made me think of the phrase bureaucratic inertia. And it takes a lot of energy and a lot of effort to get that moving. And I think one of the things that makes it hard is you don't know how much energy or effort that's going to take. And so I think we see individuals and groups it can easily get discouraged when they're working on things like this. And given that, do you have any words of wisdom or support for anyone who might be in a similar position where they're facing some of this inertia that they're up against for their work?
Use your network, use the people to get the word out, I think is the key. People and people you think care about, and we have access at our fingertips to social media, unlike we did 20 years ago in terms of spreading the word. And so people can influence others around the world in their storytelling, and that's one of the things that in encouraging teenagers to use photo essays to document their experience in stream ecosystems and in aquatic ecosystems is having them tell their story, engaging in the outdoors and engaging in aquatic environments, because that helps other people, inspires other people to engage too.
Great. Excellent. We do have another question up here. This one's from Paul Kovac. Is there a regional watershed that you would say is in greatest need of radiation?
Yeah, I think Paul probably auto-corrected to radiation from remediation.
It would be. Yeah, I
Yeah.
believe so. I didn't want to correct him yet because that was a question, but we'll assume that.
Yeah, that's always the autocorrect, and often in words like remediation, can get corrected. So yes, I don't know if single watershed, but certainly one of the I'll talk it more in general terms. One of the areas that we face here in Western Pennsylvania is the issue of acid mine drainage, and certain organizations like Trout Unlimited, other local groups are working to restore some of the streams to the east of Pittsburgh and northeast of Pittsburgh that have been impacted by acid mine drainage. And we're dealing with legacies of past environmental degradation. The companies that caused that degradation aren't around to pay for the cleanup. And it wasn't until years later that taxes on coal were levied to deal with acid mine drainage. And so one of the challenges we're facing is that restoration of acid mine impacted watersheds is tied to current extraction of coal. So it's like a continuing loop of potential future pollution. And while coal companies have done a good job complying with regulations, we have to think about what legacy problems are we setting ourselves up for the future by not addressing these concerns today. And in some examples, they've been restoring watersheds in the West Branch of the Susquehanna River, for example, for native brook trout. But there are other watersheds where that is challenging. The Turtle Creek watershed here flows in Monongahela has a lot of acid mine drainage. And that's why the one reason the Chalfont Ron Thompson Watershed Association and Turtle Creek Watershed Association, they're interested in improving water quality, but they have there's a lot of inertia in some of these streams just to discuss restoration, because you have a built environment on top of those former mine sites too.
And speaking of remediation, if anyone here hasn't, I would strongly recommend visiting the Wingfield Pines acid mine drainage remediation site along Chartiers Creek. It is just fantastically diverse with life down there, and it really shows what can be done, and that's just a passive system that they use down there, and just the amount of biodiversity it draws is fantastic.
Yeah, that's an example of where positive things can come out of restoration projects to address those problems. Often people ask, well, what can I do? Well, one thing being considered by Congress right now, and it's been proposed the last couple of Congresses, is the Wild and Scenic, or the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, and it's a bipartisan bill. And you can look up Recovering America's Wildlife Act and contact your local representative. I have to do it for my local representative. But we have a lot of co-sponsors from Pennsylvania, both Republican and Democrat parties are co-sponsors of this bill. They have to come to agreement with the Senate version, but it's something that has bipartisan support. It's something that will provide money to the states and tribes. And in Pennsylvania, it would amount to tens of millions of dollars to deal with some of these problems with managing rare and imperiled species. And so when people ask, what can I do? The Recovering America's Wildlife Act is one example of where you can contact your senators and your state representative in Congress, your local representative in Congress, to address this law and get it passed.
Great. So it's the point in the evening here where we're going to ask for a last call for questions. I saw Stephanie's question just come in. So if you're sitting on a question, wondering if it's a good question, trust me, it's a great question. Go ahead and type it in the Q&A box, and we'll address any of these last remaining questions that do come in. But let's take this one here from Stephanie. Speaking of policy, with the infrastructure bill passing, do you foresee issues with NEPA and the Section 106, 110 process impacting watersheds and restorations?
Yeah, I'm not, Stephanie, thank you for the question. I'm not an expert on the National Environmental Policy Act and in that particular section. So I will provide that caveat. I know a lot of the nonprofit organizations that represent science perspective have been involved in conversations with infrastructure bill, and I'm not, unfortunately, I'd have to look up the particulars. I'm not, without further information, I'm not equipped to answer that. I mean, I do know here in Pittsburgh, the infrastructure is with respect to locks and dams on our rivers and other aspects of build infrastructure on our rivers, the infrastructure bill could have impact. And there is a local representative working on Ohio River restoration bill, because a lot of other river systems have gotten attention throughout the United States, but the Ohio River has not gotten the funding like the funding to the Great Lakes restoration initiatives. So I would have to look up the particulars, Stephanie. I just don't, unfortunately, I just don't know.
All right. Well, thanks for asking, Stephanie, and hopefully if you need help finding an expert to answer that question, send us an email at the Science Center from our website, and we'll see if we have someone in our Rolodex that we can connect you with. Well, this seems to be the natural conclusion here. We don't see any more questions rolling in at this point. Patrick, I would like to thank you on behalf of Dan and myself and Carnegie Science Center for being our speaker here tonight for Café Sci, wrapping up an interesting year here in 2021 where we did all of our Café Sci presentations online. So thank you for being part of our virtual roster. And a reminder, you can see this talk on YouTube in perpetuity. Share the link with your friends, and we look forward to seeing everyone back on site for Café Sci, barring any virus developments that may preclude us from doing on-site programs in 2022. Thank you everyone for tuning in. It's been a blast tonight, and we will see you in the new year. Thanks everyone.